A single photograph crossed Admiral Takeshi Yamamoto's desk in the autumn of 1943, and for a long moment he simply stared. The image showed an American factory floor stretching into impossible distance, and on that floor sat not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of identical vehicles lined in perfect rows like soldiers awaiting orders. Small, boxy, unremarkable machines that the Americans called jeeps. Yamamoto's hands trembled as he set the photograph down. His aide, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, watched his commander's face drain of color. The numbers scrawled on the back of the photo told a story that defied comprehension. 640,000 jeeps produced in 4 years. Japan's entire automotive industry could not manufacture a tenth of that number in a decade. How could any nation possess such power? How could flesh and will compete against a machine that never slept, never tired, never stopped churning out the instruments of war? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Jeep seemed insignificant at first glance. It possessed no armor to speak of, no intimidating weaponry, no elegant engineering that would make tacticians pause in admiration. Yet this humble vehicle would become the symbol of American industrial supremacy, the four-wheeled embodiment of a production philosophy that Japan could neither match nor understand. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, across the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, through the mud-choked roads of Europe, the Jeep rolled forward, carrying soldiers, supplies, weapons, and wounded men. It climbed mountains that seemed impassable, forded rivers that threatened to swallow it whole, and when one broke down, 3 more appeared to replace it. Japanese officers who captured these vehicles in the early days of the war studied them with confusion. The Jeep was simple, almost crude in its construction. Surely such a basic machine could not represent the peak of American engineering. Surely this was evidence of inferior craftsmanship, of a nation that valued quantity over quality. They were catastrophically wrong. The simplicity was intentional, calculated, and utterly brilliant. Every bolt, every wire, every component had been designed not for elegance but for one purpose: to be manufactured quickly, repaired easily, and replaced instantly. While Japanese engineers labored to perfect complex vehicles that required skilled craftsmen and rare materials, American factories pumped out Jeeps using assembly lines so efficient that a complete vehicle rolled off the production floor every 2 minutes. 2 minutes. The time it took a soldier to smoke a cigarette, another Jeep entered the world. Admiral Yamamoto understood what this meant long before his superiors would admit it. The photograph was not just evidence of industrial capacity, it was a death sentence. The story of how America built this machine, how it transformed a nation's factories into an unstoppable torrent of vehicles, and how Japanese generals slowly realized they were fighting not just an army, but an entire continent retooled for war, began years before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. It began in a place far from battlefields, in the mind of a man who saw the future of warfare and understood that victory would belong not to the bravest soldiers, but to the nation that could supply them fastest. Major General Jacob Harrison had never fired a shot in anger, yet his vision would kill more enemy soldiers than any battalion. In 1940, while Europe burned and Asia trembled, Harrison sat in a modest office in Detroit, surrounded by factory owners, engineers, and automobile executives who looked at him with polite skepticism. He had come with an impossible request: design and produce a light reconnaissance vehicle that could be manufactured by the tens of thousands, delivered within months, and cost less than $1,000 per unit. The room erupted in laughter. One executive, a portly man named Charles Bennington, who ran one of Detroit's largest plants, shook his head with barely concealed contempt. "General," he said, "what you're asking for violates every principle of automotive engineering. A vehicle that light would be fragile, a vehicle that cheap would be unreliable, and producing tens of thousands, we would need to retool every factory in the Midwest." Harrison did not argue. He simply placed a map on the table, a map of Europe with black arrows showing German advances, of Asia with red circles marking Japanese conquests. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "in 2 years, maybe less, this nation will be at war. When that happens, we will need to move soldiers and supplies across every terrain imaginable. Deserts, jungles, mountains, swamps. We will need a vehicle that can go anywhere, carry anything, and keep moving when everything else breaks down. We will need it in numbers that dwarf anything you have ever produced, and we will need it fast." The room fell silent. Bennington leaned back in his chair, studying the general with new eyes. "You are talking about transforming the entire automotive industry," he said. "You are talking about abandoning profit margins, about standardization on a scale never attempted. You are asking us to become a military machine." Harrison nodded. "I am asking you to become the reason we win." 3 companies accepted the challenge: Willys Overland, Ford, and Bantam. The competition was brutal. Each company had 49 days to design, build, and deliver a working prototype. 49 days to create a vehicle that would define modern warfare. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock, sleeping at their drafting tables, living on coffee and cigarettes and the strange electric thrill of knowing they were building something that mattered. Bantam delivered first, a small, nimble vehicle that could climb a 60% grade and ford through 2 feet of water. Willys followed with a more powerful engine, a design that emphasized durability over speed. Ford brought mass production expertise, the ability to turn blueprints into thousands of identical machines. The Army tested each prototype mercilessly, driving them through mud pits, up mountain trails, across rivers, through conditions designed to break axles and shatter suspensions. All 3 vehicles survived. But it was the Willys design, refined and improved, that would become the template. By July 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor, the first contracts were signed. Willys Overland would produce the vehicle, now officially designated the Willys MB. Ford would manufacture an identical version called the GPW. Together, they would build more vehicles than any other military project in history. The Jeep that emerged was deceptively simple. It weighed just over 2,000 pounds, measured 11 feet long, carried 4 soldiers, and could reach speeds of 65 miles per hour on flat ground. It had 4-wheel drive, a feature that was revolutionary for its time, allowing it to maintain traction on surfaces where conventional vehicles would helplessly spin their wheels. The engine, a modest 60-horsepower design, was not powerful by automotive standards, but it was reliable, easy to maintain, and could run on low-grade fuel. Every component was interchangeable. A carburetor from a Jeep built in Toledo could fit perfectly into a Jeep built in Detroit. Spark plugs, axles, transmissions, everything was standardized. A mechanic could repair a broken Jeep using parts from another broken Jeep, and within an hour have a working vehicle. But the true genius was not in the design, it was in the production. Harrison had convinced the government to do something unprecedented, mandate complete cooperation between competing companies. Ford and Willys shared blueprints, techniques, supplier networks. Patents were suspended, trade secrets were revealed. The goal was not profit but volume, not market share but victory. Factory floors were reorganized, according to principles developed by Henry Ford decades earlier, but refined now to a terrifying efficiency. Each worker performed a single task, repeated thousands of times a day until the motion became instinctive, unconscious. Components arrived on conveyor belts in precise sequence: engines, transmissions, chassis, wheels, each piece moving down the line in choreographed rhythm. A partially assembled Jeep would enter one end of the factory as scattered parts and emerge at the other end, 90 minutes later, as a fully functional vehicle ready for war. The scale was biblical. At the Willys plant in Toledo, Ohio, the assembly line stretched for miles inside a building so vast that workers used bicycles to travel from one end to the other. The noise was constant, a thundering symphony of rivets, welders, engines roaring to life for their first test drive. The smell of hot metal, rubber, oil, and sweat hung thick in the air. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Shifts ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers came from every background, men and women, young and old, farmers who had never touched a wrench, and engineers who had designed luxury automobiles. They were united by a single purpose, and they moved with a focus that bordered on religious fervor. One worker, a woman named Margaret Chen, who had left her teaching job to work the assembly line, later described the experience. "We knew what we were building," she said. "Every Jeep that left our factory was going to save lives. Maybe it would carry a wounded soldier to a medic. Maybe it would haul ammunition to the front lines just in time to stop an enemy advance. We did not just build vehicles. We built hope." By the end of 1941, production had reached 500 Jeeps per day. By 1942, that number doubled. By 1943, it doubled again. The factories consumed raw materials at a staggering rate: steel, rubber, copper, glass, leather. Supply chains stretched across the continent. Mines in Minnesota sent iron ore to smelters in Pennsylvania, which sent steel to factories in Michigan and Ohio. Rubber plantations in South America shipped latex to processing plants on the Gulf Coast. The entire industrial capacity of the United States reoriented itself around a single question: how do we build more Jeeps faster? Japanese intelligence officers, monitoring American production through spies and intercepted communications, reported the numbers to their superiors. The reports were dismissed as exaggeration, as propaganda meant to demoralize. No nation could produce vehicles at such speed. It was physically impossible. The laws of manufacturing, of logistics, of human labor, all dictated limits that could not be exceeded. Admiral Yamamoto knew better. He had studied in America, had walked through its cities, seen its factories, understood its culture in ways his colleagues did not. When the first intelligence reports arrived claiming that American Jeep production had exceeded 10,000 vehicles per month, he did not laugh. He requested confirmation. When that confirmation arrived, he gathered his senior staff and showed them the numbers. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are not fighting an army. We are fighting a factory." His staff remained unconvinced. Lieutenant General Masahiro Tanaka, a decorated combat veteran, scoffed at the notion. "Vehicles do not win wars," he said. "Spirit wins wars. Discipline wins wars. The Americans have factories, but we have warriors who will fight to the death." Yamamoto said nothing. He had learned that some men could not be convinced with words, only with reality. Reality arrived on the islands of the Pacific. When American forces landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, Japanese soldiers encountered jeeps for the first time in significant numbers. The vehicles seemed to be everywhere, moving through jungle terrain that should have been impassable, appearing on trails that should have been too narrow, too steep, too treacherous for any motorized transport. Japanese supply lines relied on human porters, men carrying supplies on their backs through the jungle, a method that was slow, exhausting, and vulnerable to ambush. American supply lines relied on jeeps, which could carry 10 times the load in a fraction of the time. A Japanese unit might spend an entire day moving ammunition from the rear to the front lines. An American unit could accomplish the same task in an hour. The disparity became crushing. Japanese soldiers, hungry and low on ammunition, watched American troops eating hot meals delivered by jeep, firing artillery shells hauled by jeep, receiving medical care from doctors who arrived by jeep. Major Kenji Sato, commanding a battalion on Guadalcanal, wrote in his diary, "We fight ghosts. They are everywhere and nowhere. Their vehicles move through terrain our maps say is impassable. When we destroy one, two more appear. How can we win against an enemy who can replace everything we destroy?" The answer was simple and terrible. They could not. American losses were replaced within days. A jeep destroyed by artillery fire was mourned for a moment, then forgotten, because another jeep was already en route from a transport ship, and behind that ship were a dozen more, and behind those ships were factories producing hundreds more every single day. Japanese commanders began to understand what Yamamoto had tried to tell them. This was not a war of courage against courage, discipline against discipline. This was a war of production, of industrial capacity, of a nation that had turned its entire economy into a weapon. Captain Riku Yoshida, an intelligence officer stationed in the Philippines, submitted a report in early 1943 that caused alarm in Tokyo. He had interviewed prisoners, examined captured documents, and studied American logistics. His conclusion was stark. The Americans do not fight like an army. They fight like a machine. Their doctrine is simple: overwhelm with numbers. For every vehicle we destroy, they produce 10. For every soldier we kill, they train 20. They do not seek elegant victories. They seek to bury us under the weight of their industry. The report reached the desk of General Hideki Tojo, Japan's Prime Minister and Minister of War. He read it in silence, then called a meeting of the Supreme War Council. Maps were spread across the table, showing American advances across the Pacific, each advance marked by the telltale presence of jeeps in reconnaissance photos. Tojo looked at his generals and asked a question that no one wanted to answer. Can we match their production? The silence was answer enough. Japan's automotive industry, even running at maximum capacity, produced fewer vehicles in a year than America produced in a month. Japan's steel production was a fraction of America's. Japan's oil reserves, already strained, could not sustain the kind of mechanized warfare the Americans practiced. One general, a man named Yoshiro Umezu, spoke the truth that everyone knew but no one wanted to voice. "We cannot match them," he said. "We never could. Our only hope was to win quickly, decisively, before their industrial power could be fully mobilized. We failed. Now we are in a war of attrition against an enemy with limitless resources." Tojo's face remained impassive, but those who knew him saw the despair in his eyes. The meeting ended without resolution because there was no resolution to be found. Japan would continue fighting, continue sacrificing, continue hoping that spirit and sacrifice could somehow overcome steel and assembly lines. But deep in the minds of Japan's most senior commanders, a truth had taken root: they were already defeated. The only question was how long it would take for the rest of the nation to realize it. Back in Detroit, in Toledo, in factories across the American Midwest, workers continued their relentless rhythm, unaware that their labor had already decided the war's outcome. They did not know about Admiral Yamamoto's despair or General Tojo's silent acknowledgement of defeat. They knew only that their country needed jeeps, and they would build them until the war ended, or their hands could no longer hold a wrench. Margaret Chen, the former teacher, worked the night shift, installing windshield frames on jeeps that rolled past her station every 90 seconds. Her hands moved automatically, reaching for parts, positioning them, securing bolts, repeating the sequence thousands of times until the motion became as natural as breathing. She thought about her brother, who was fighting somewhere in the Pacific, and she imagined that maybe, just maybe, one of the jeeps she built would carry him to safety. That thought kept her hands steady, even when exhaustion made her vision blur. The jeep had become more than a vehicle. It had become a symbol, a promise that America would deliver whatever was needed, whenever it was needed, in numbers that defied comprehension. Japanese propaganda called it evidence of American wastefulness, of a nation so rich it could afford to build throwaway vehicles instead of investing in quality. Japanese soldiers, starving in their foxholes while jeeps rolled past American positions, knew better. They knew they were fighting a war they could not win, against an enemy they could not outlast. General Harrison, the man who had started it all in that Detroit meeting room, rarely spoke about his role in the jeep's creation. When asked by reporters how it felt to design a vehicle that had changed the course of the war, he would simply say that he had done his duty. But those who worked closely with him saw the satisfaction in his eyes when production reports arrived, when the numbers climbed higher and higher, when the factories exceeded every projection and shattered every limit that experts had claimed was unbreakable. By mid-1943, American Jeep production had reached a pace that seemed impossible: over 30,000 vehicles per month, nearly 1,000 per day, one every 90 minutes from dozens of factories running in perfect synchronization. The vehicles poured onto transport ships, which carried them across oceans to every theater of war. In North Africa, jeeps raced across desert sands, their engines modified to handle extreme heat and sand infiltration. In Europe, they slogged through mud that would have trapped heavier vehicles. In the Pacific, they splashed through rivers, climbed volcanic slopes, and navigated jungles so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding forces in the Philippines, watched through binoculars as an American convoy approached his position. He counted the vehicles, 17 jeeps, moving in formation, carrying troops and supplies. His own supply convoy, scheduled to arrive that morning, had been delayed by mechanical breakdowns and lack of fuel. The contrast was unbearable. He lowered the binoculars and turned to his aide, Major Takeshi Fujimoto, a young officer who still believed in ultimate victory. Fujimoto was excitedly discussing a new defensive strategy, a plan to lure American forces into an ambush. Yamashita interrupted him gently. "Major, how many vehicles does your plan require?" Fujimoto paused, confused by the question. "We have 18 trucks remaining in operational condition, sir. 14 of those require repairs but are functional. We can use them to transport troops and establish the ambush." Yamashita nodded slowly. "And when those trucks break down, as they inevitably will, how will you replace them?" Fujimoto's confident expression faltered. "We will repair them, sir. We have skilled mechanics." Yamashita gestured toward the American convoy, now disappearing into the jungle. "They do not repair," he said quietly. "They replace. Do you understand the difference?" Fujimoto did not answer. Yamashita continued, his voice heavy with resignation. "We are fighting a war of the last century with tactics of the last century. They are fighting a war of production, of industry, of endless resources. Every vehicle we destroy is replaced within days. Every vehicle we lose is gone forever. This is not a war we can win through courage or strategy. This is a war we have already lost, and we are simply too proud to surrender." The words hung in the air like a funeral dirge. Fujimoto wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Japanese spirit would prevail, but the evidence was everywhere. In the skies, American planes flew unopposed. On the seas, American ships blockaded every port. And on the land, American jeeps moved with impunity, delivering supplies, evacuating wounded, scouting positions, doing 100 tasks that Japanese forces had to accomplish with human labor alone. Back in Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto received another intelligence report, this one detailing American jeep production for the first quarter of 1944. The numbers were staggering, 93,000 vehicles in 3 months. He did not show the report to his superiors. There was no point. They would dismiss it as propaganda or ignore it entirely, preferring to focus on tactical victories that meant nothing in the larger scope of industrial warfare. Instead, Yamamoto filed the report in his personal archives, a growing collection of evidence that documented Japan's slow strangulation. He had tried to warn them before the war began, had argued against attacking a nation with 10 times Japan's industrial capacity. He had been overruled by men who believed that spirit could overcome steel, that warriors could defeat factories. Now those men sent increasingly desperate orders to fight harder, sacrifice more, hold positions that could not be held. Yamamoto knew how the war would end. The only question was how many would die before his colleagues accepted the inevitable. In the factories of America, the production continued without pause. Workers who had started in 1941 were now veterans of the assembly line, their hands scarred from years of repetitive motion, their ears permanently damaged by the constant roar of machinery. New workers arrived daily, trained in a matter of days, and absorbed into the great machine that turned raw materials into jeeps with relentless efficiency. The war had transformed American industry in ways that would last for generations. The lessons learned in producing jeeps, the techniques of standardization, mass production, and supply chain coordination would become the foundation of post-war prosperity. But in 1944, no one thought about the future. They thought only about the present, about the son or husband or brother fighting overseas who needed these vehicles to stay alive. Margaret Chen's brother, Private First Class David Chen, was indeed saved by a jeep. Wounded during the battle for Saipan, he was evacuated from the front lines in a jeep that raced through enemy fire, carrying him to a field hospital where surgeons saved his life. He never knew which factory had built that jeep, never knew that his sister might have installed its windshield or tightened its bolts. But when he returned home after the war, he made it a point to visit the Willys plant in Toledo and shake the hand of every worker he met. "Thank you," he would say simply. "You saved my life." The story of the jeep, of how America buried its enemies under an avalanche of production, was not a story of brilliant generals or heroic battles. It was a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary work, of a nation that understood that wars are won not just by soldiers, but by the workers who supply them. General Harrison, now elderly and retired, was asked in 1960 to reflect on his greatest achievement. He thought for a long moment before answering. "We did not build jeeps," he said finally, "we built victory. We built the understanding that in modern warfare, industrial capacity matters more than individual courage. We built a system that could not be defeated because it could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. The jeep was just a vehicle, but what it represented was the power of a free nation mobilizing every resource, every factory, every worker toward a common purpose. That power was unstoppable." The photograph that had once made Admiral Yamamoto tremble, the image of thousands of jeeps lined up in perfect rows, became an iconic representation of American industrial might. It was published in newspapers, displayed in museums, studied in military academies. But for those who understood its true meaning, it was something more. A warning that in the age of industrial warfare, victory belongs not to the bravest army, but to the strongest economy, not to the most skilled warriors, but to the most efficient factories. Japan had entered the war believing that spirit could overcome material, that sacrifice could defeat supply lines, that honor could outlast production. They learned, at terrible cost, that belief is not enough. In the ashes of their defeat, Japanese engineers would study American production methods, would adopt the principles of standardization and efficiency, and would eventually build an automotive industry that rivaled America's own. But in 1944, as jeeps rolled off assembly lines by the thousands and Japanese forces crumbled across the Pacific, that future seemed impossibly distant. The war would continue for another year, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. The Jeep had seen to that, one vehicle at a time, rolling off production lines in a rhythm that never slowed, never stopped, never gave the enemy a moment's respite. Major General Jacob Harrison passed away in 1967, largely forgotten by a public that celebrated combat heroes but rarely remembered the logisticians who made victory possible. His funeral was attended by a handful of former colleagues and a surprising number of factory workers, men and women who had spent years building Jeeps and wanted to honor the man who had given them purpose. Margaret Chen was there, her hands still bearing the scars of assembly line work. She placed a small metal bolt on his casket, a bolt from one of the Jeeps she had helped build 25 years earlier. It seemed fitting. Harrison had given the nation a blueprint for victory, and workers like her had turned that blueprint into reality, one bolt at a time, until the weight of American production crushed every enemy who dared to stand against it. The turning point came not in a single battle, but in 1,000 small moments across the Pacific theater. On Tarawa, Captain James Mitchell watched his supply convoy navigate terrain that military doctrine claimed was impassable for motorized vehicles. The Jeeps climbed over coral ridges, splashed through tidal pools, and delivered ammunition to forward positions while Japanese defenders watched in disbelief from their bunkers. Their own supplies, carried by hand through the same terrain, arrived hours too late. The battle was decided not by superior tactics but by superior logistics. Mitchell later wrote in his report that the Jeep had fundamentally altered the mathematics of warfare. Time, distance, and carrying capacity were no longer limiting factors for American forces. On Peleliu, Lieutenant Sarah Brennan commanded a medical evacuation unit operating 12 Jeeps modified with stretcher racks. In a single day, her unit evacuated 73 wounded Marines from the front lines to field hospitals, trips that would have required hundreds of stretcher bearers working in relay. The wounded arrived faster, their chances of survival dramatically improved. Japanese forces, lacking similar capability, watched their own wounded die in forward positions, unable to evacuate them through the volcanic terrain. The disparity was not merely numerical but existential. American commanders could afford to be aggressive because they knew wounded soldiers would receive immediate evacuation. Japanese commanders grew increasingly cautious, knowing that casualties were effectively permanent losses. By early 1945, the production numbers had reached heights that seemed divorced from reality. 640,000 Jeeps had rolled off American assembly lines, a number so vast that it exceeded the total vehicle production of Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. Factories had become so efficient that production costs had dropped to $740 per vehicle, below the initial target price. The Jeep had evolved from military necessity to industrial triumph, proof that American manufacturing could accomplish anything given sufficient motivation and organization. Workers took pride in the numbers, in knowing that their labor had tangible, measurable impact on the war's outcome. Colonel Robert Hayes, a logistics officer stationed in Manila, stood in a warehouse filled with Jeeps awaiting distribution to combat units. The vehicles stretched in neat rows as far as he could see, hundreds of them, and this was just one warehouse among dozens scattered across the Pacific. He tried to imagine the factories that had produced this abundance, the workers who had assembled each vehicle, the supply chains that had delivered them across an ocean. The scale was incomprehensible, and yet here was the evidence, solid and undeniable. Hayes had studied military history and knew that logistics had always been the silent determiner of victory. Alexander the Great succeeded because he solved the problem of feeding his army across vast distances. Napoleon failed in Russia because his supply lines collapsed. The Jeep had given America an advantage that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome. Japanese Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, preparing his defenses on Iwo Jima, understood this reality with painful clarity. His intelligence officers had reported the scale of American vehicle deployment, the endless stream of Jeeps carrying supplies to invasion forces. Kuribayashi wrote in his journal that he was not fighting soldiers but fighting an industrial system that could afford to waste resources on a scale Japan could barely comprehend. He had witnessed Jeeps being abandoned when they suffered minor mechanical problems, left behind because replacing them was easier than repairing them. This casual abundance was more demoralizing than any weapon. It spoke to a depth of resources that made Japanese resistance feel futile. The psychological impact extended beyond military commanders to ordinary soldiers. Private Yoshio Tanaka, captured on Okinawa, told his interrogators that the sight of American Jeeps had convinced him the war was lost long before his unit surrendered. "We were starving," he said, eating grass and roots while American soldiers drove past us eating hot meals delivered fresh from their rear areas. We had no medicine, no ammunition, no hope. They had everything, and more arrived every day. How could we believe our officers when they told us we were winning? The Jeep became a symbol of everything Japan lacked, a rolling reminder that this was a war of economies, not merely of armies. In Washington, General Harrison received reports from field commanders praising the Jeep's performance in conditions ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical jungle. The vehicle had exceeded every expectation, had proven adaptable to modifications that allowed it to serve as an ambulance, a weapons platform, a communications hub, even a mobile command post. Engineers had mounted machine guns on Jeeps for reconnaissance units, attached trailers for additional cargo capacity, and waterproofed them for amphibious landings. The basic design remained unchanged, but its versatility seemed limitless. Harrison understood that this adaptability was itself a product of the production philosophy he had championed. Simplicity allowed for innovation, standardization enabled specialization. The final months of the war saw Jeeps leading columns into previously unimaginable locations. They drove through the ruins of Manila, climbed mountain roads in Burma, forded rivers in China. Everywhere they went, they represented not just American military power but American industrial philosophy. The willingness to sacrifice elegance for efficiency, to embrace standardization over customization, to value reliability above performance. These were principles that would reshape global manufacturing in the decades following the war, but in 1945 they were simply the methods that had buried Japan under an avalanche of production. Admiral Yamamoto, who had foreseen this outcome years earlier, did not live to see the war's end. Shot down over the Solomon Islands in 1943, he died knowing his warnings had been ignored, his prophecies dismissed. But his photograph, the one showing thousands of Jeeps in perfect rows, remained in Japanese military archives, a silent testament to his understanding of modern warfare. After the war, Japanese officers studying their defeat would return to that image again and again, trying to comprehend how they had so badly miscalculated their enemy's capabilities. The Jeep production machine finally slowed in August 1945, when Japan surrendered and contracts were canceled. Factories that had run continuously for 4 years fell silent. Workers, accustomed to the rhythm of assembly lines, found themselves suddenly without purpose. Margaret Chen walked through the empty Willys plant one final time, her footsteps echoing in spaces that had once thundered with machinery. She touched the conveyor belts, the tool stations, the painted floor markings that had guided millions of components to their destinations. This factory had consumed years of her life, had scarred her hands and damaged her hearing, but she felt no resentment. She had been part of something larger than herself, had contributed to a victory that saved millions of lives. The legacy of those years would echo through American industry for generations. The techniques perfected in Jeep production became the foundation for post-war manufacturing dominance. The culture of continuous improvement, of relentless efficiency, of standardization and quality control, these principles shaped everything from automobiles to appliances to electronics. Japan, studying American methods as part of its reconstruction, would eventually master and refine these techniques, building an industrial base that would challenge American supremacy by the 1980s. But that future lay decades away. In 1945, the lesson was clear and brutal. Modern wars were won by factories, not just by soldiers. Victory belonged to nations that could mobilize their entire industrial capacity, that could transform civilian economies into military machines operating at maximum efficiency. The Jeep, humble and unglamorous, had proven this truth beyond any doubt. It had carried American forces across every battlefield, had evacuated their wounded, had supplied their weapons, had enabled their victories. 640,000 vehicles, each one a small piece of a vast industrial triumph. General Harrison, in his final interview before retiring, was asked what he was most proud of. He paused, considering the question carefully. The Jeep itself was good, he said, but what I'm truly proud of is that we proved American industry could accomplish anything when properly motivated and organized. We took a nation of farmers and factory workers and showed them they could outproduce the world. That legacy, that confidence, that understanding of our own capabilities, that will matter long after the last Jeep rusts away. He was right. The Jeep had won a war, but more importantly, it had revealed what America could accomplish when crisis demanded transformation. The last Jeep rolled off the production line on August 20th. Workers gathered around it, some crying, some cheering, all understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary. This final vehicle, like all those before it, was simple, functional, built to last. It would serve for years in various capacities before eventually ending up in a museum, preserved as a reminder of the moment when American industrial might crushed an empire that believed spirit could defeat steel. The Jeep had no such illusions. It was metal and rubber and glass, assembled by human hands, shipped across oceans, and used until it broke or the war ended. It represented not honor or glory, but something more powerful, the absolute supremacy of organized industrial production over every other factor in modern warfare. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.